This is Dr. Raymond Sulay, your moderator for today's session. I am speaking on behalf of the UP Med Class 94 webinar team. The UP webinar series is an initiative of the University of the Philippines Medical Alumni Society. It is held every Wednesday from 12 noon to 1 p.m. Manila time. It dwells on important and current and emerging medical topics and is targeted for physicians, especially general practitioners, occupational and industrial health doctors, primary care physicians, and community medicine physicians and other health workers. Registration is free. This webinar runs on the UP Manila live streaming platform at livestream.upm.edu.ph. If you have difficulties in accessing the webinar through the live stream page, please watch the FB Live video on our Facebook page. This session will run for an hour with 30 to 45 minutes allotted for lectures, followed by a question and answer portion. To participate in the webinar, please use the Q&A box found on the live stream page. For Facebook Live participants, please type your questions in the comment box. Please only use the comment section for questions and other webinar concerns. An evaluation link will be emailed to you after the webinar. Please answer it to get a copy of your certificate. Our time now is 12:08 in the afternoon, and I'm speaking from the Research Institute of the Perpetual Soccer Hospital at Cebu City. Today's webinar is entitled the Tide of Human Papillomavirus, or HPV. The objectives are as follows: to describe the burden of disease caused by HPV infection, to elaborate the mechanism of how HPV infection leads to cervical cancer, third, to discuss the approach of cervical cancer prevention through HPV vaccination and screening, and last, to discuss other diseases that can be prevented by HPV vaccination. Our speaker today is Dr. Jeanne Toral. Dr. Toral is a graduate of the UP College of Medicine and is part of this year's Silver Jubilarian class of 1994. She took her residency in General Obstetrics and Gynecology and her fellowship in Gynecologic Oncology at UP-PGH. She also completed her master's in Clinical Epidemiology at the UP College of Medicine. At present, Dr. Toral is an associate professor at the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at UP-PGH. She is also the coordinator for research of the Philippine General Hospital. May we now call on Dr. Jeanne Toral.
Thank you, Raymond, for the kind introduction. So this topic is timely because it's Women's Month, and we will be talking about HPV, which is the necessary cause of cervical cancer. However, you will find out that this is actually not just a concern of women, it's also the concern of men. So Raymond has mentioned the objectives for this lecture. So what is HPV? It's a small double-stranded DNA virus that commonly affects humans. And there are more than 200 genotypes grouped in various genera of the Papillomavirus family. They are heterogeneous but share the same genome structure and organization, as I will show you later. And majority of the infections caused by HPV have no symptoms. So some people will not even find out that they had HPV infection in the past. And in a patient with an intact immune system, these infections are cleared within 12 to 24 months. And only a small fraction of these infections that will persist or progress to a pre-neoplastic lesion, which will later on become cancer. HPV infects both men and women, and the burden of disease, however, is greater in women because of the propensity of the cervical cells to this infection. So let me just show you this picture telling us that also males are infected by HPV. Of course, the biggest would be genital warts at 30 million. Among the cancers, of course, cervical cancer is the most. Also for cancer among, but let me point out too that men also can have penile cancer and anal cancer and oropharyngeal cancer, which could be HPV related. In another graph, this just shows you a pyramid, and see the base of the pyramid, the biggest is still genital warts, and then the next one would be your pre-malignant lesions, the low-grade and the high-grade lesions. Cervical cancer is here, but among the cancers, it's still the most in number, even if it only affects women. Of course, the others are of smaller number, but still are significant. So just the key stats. So most of the stats that I will show you came from the latest IARC data of 2018, which shows us that the incidence of cervical cancer is that there are almost 570,000 new cervical cancer cases in the world. And as such, it ranks as the third leading cause of female cancer in women. And it's the second most common among the reproductive age 15 to 44 years in the world. And with regards to mortality, if you have more than almost 570,000 women, more than half of that will die. And so it's also the third leading cause of female mortality, and it's the second most common cause of female cancer deaths, next only to breast CA. Okay, so this table just shows you that the standardized mortality rate per 100,000 women is at 6.9, and the incidence is at 13.1. But you have to look that the burden of cervical HPV infection for cervical cancer, it's almost 70%, meaning HPV accounts for 70% as the cause of cervical cancer. But you have to also look that even patients with normal pap smear would have HPV at 4.1%. And then, of course, you also have the low-grade and the high-grade lesions also taking a share of the burden of HPV. Now let's look at the Philippine data. Again, this is the latest from GloboCan of 2018, and it just tells you that in both sexes, cervical cancer is the sixth overall in incidence as well as in mortality, and it's the third overall in 5-year prevalence for all ages. So this is where cervical cancer is 6 in incidence and also 6 in mortality. So that's pretty high. Among all women, it's only second to breast. And see what is the age standardized incidence rate for cervix cancer. It's at 14.9 for the Philippine data. And comparing it to our Asian neighbors, we are actually the 10th. So Indonesia and Thailand actually have higher age standardized incidence rate of cervical cancer. How then can HPV, a virus, cause cancer? No? So based on the latest IARC table of oncogenic types of HPV, they reported 12. These are 16 and 18. These are the most common. Then you have 31, 33, 35, 39, 45, 51, 52, 56, 58, and 59. These are numbers to remember, and they are associated with cervical, anal, vaginal, vulvar, oropharyngeal cancer, and other associated precursor lesions. Of course, the low-risk types, the most common, are 6 and 11, the cause of genital warts and recurrent respiratory papillomatosis. There are still other possible carcinogenic types here listed below. So in 2006, this is the incidence and distribution of cancers attributable to HPV. So 2006, cervix is 100%, and next to it would be anal cancers at 90%, vagina, vulva, and the penis at 40%. But the latest data 6 years later would tell us that cervix uteri is still at 100%. It's the necessary cause of cervical cancer, and to a lower degree are vagina, penis, oropharynx, but anal cancer, though not so high in incidence, 88% of such cases are attributable to high-risk HPV. And looking at the HPV vaccine coverage, you can see the blue one is 16 and 18. So it covers much of the cervical cancer cases. And adding the 5 other types in the non-valent vaccine, that's the red one. But look, there are other HPV types that can cause cervical cancer, which is not covered by either the bivalent or the non-valent. control the ones covered by the vaccine, but there is still that yellow that remains uncovered. That's why even for patients or for women who have been vaccinated, they still have to go for cervical cancer screening. Okay, so these are the other sites, no? So anus also is covered mostly by 6 and 18 as well as head and neck, but still there are a lot which are not related to HPV for head and neck. So this diagram just shows us the diversity of HPV in human beings under 5 genera, the most common of which are alpha, beta, and gamma. But look at the one with the pink and the red letters. These are the most oncogenic types. They are in the alpha group. But despite this diversity, the HPV genome shares the same structure and generally. So you have your early regions E1 to E7, and you have the major capsid proteins L1 and the minor capsid protein L2, and you have the URR, which is the upstream regulatory protein, which is the origin of replication. It's a non-coding region, but it's something to do with transcription factor binding sites and gene expression control. What is important here are actually E6 and E7, because these are the oncogenic proteins which work by inhibiting the tumor suppressors P53 for E6 and PRB for E7. And therefore, if this E6 and E7 go to work, they can probably lead to persistent HPV infection and later on cancer. It's also good to mention E2, which is actually the inhibitor of E6 and E7. And if E2 is inhibited, then E6 and E7 will be doing its work inhibiting PRB and P53, and thus there is tumorogenesis. So how does HPV infection lead to cervical cancer? So this is the epithelium of the cervix. So much of what we know about HPV, although there are other cancers that it can cause, is from cervical cancer because it's the most in magnitude and it's the most studied. So it starts actually, HPV infection starts with a microtrauma in the epithelium. So there is a microtrauma that compromises the epithelial barrier. And the HPV genome is maintained at a low copy number into this basal cell area. And upon differentiation of these basal cells, what happens is that the virus replicates to a high copy here, high copy number, until it reaches the superficial zone. And in the process, L1 and L2 proteins are made, and they come up with new virions which are shed out, no, into the out of the epithelium, and this completes the HPV life cycle. However, if the infection is destined to become a persistent one, what happens is that this is a diagram showing you squamous intraepithelial lesion, wherein there is already epithelial transformation, and this infectious viral particles being shed out doesn't happen. Instead, they are here within the cells and they become immortal and having epithelial transformation and later on become cervical cancer. In general, viral infections are immunogenic, but HPV in particular is kind of wise because it goes undetected by the host. Why is this so? Because basically the life cycle is intraepithelial, and so there are no lytic lesions. So there are no secretory proteins made. Viral proteins are expressed at low levels while at the basal layer, and there are no inflammatory reaction as well. There is no viremia, there is no host cell death, therefore there is impaired T-cell immunity. Aside from that, there are also other immune evasion strategies that HPV has, including both intracellular and extracellular mechanisms that make it undetected by the host. No? So when you see it, probably you will already maybe maybe it's just another drawing showing you what happens in the normal cervix, which is infected by the HPV and goes through the life cycle of the HPV with the shedding of the virus. But in the malignant transformation of the cervix, the E6 and E7 goes to work, the oncogenic proteins inhibiting, again, P53 and the retinoblastoma gene, and this leads to persistent HPV infection, which later on can become cervical cancer. So not all women and men who get HPV infection will develop cancer, because some will be able to just have the normal life cycle of the virus and get shed out, but those with persistent infections are the ones which will develop cancer. So what is the definition now of persistence? There's actually no standard definition, but it says that if you have 2 monitorings of HPV DNA testing and you have positive for the same HPV type, it's persistent. However, some studies would show that a 24-month definition of persistence has a higher specificity, but many authors would put it at 12 months because they really don't know whether the first determination of HPV is actually the start of the infection. So that provides us with a window that initial HPV determination is actually a prevalent one. It was not just one that came out at that moment. So the 12 months has been used as the definition for persistent HPV infection, which can later on develop into cancer. However, that time period is not short, no? It is very long. That's why this very long latent period can actually be a good opportunity to detect the pre-malignant lesions of the cancers. So I've mentioned the viral properties of HPV. Now we go to the host factors as determinants of the behavior of HPV. So this graph shows you the factors that can affect the prevalence of HPV. So the age of sexual immunization usually is the index to tell us that one person has been infected or has been exposed to HPV. So in general, there is an increase in HPV infection after sexual debut. And this graph, the crest of this graph is actually also modified by letter B, which is the number of sexual partners. So the more sexual partners you have, the likely that the prevalent HPV would be higher among these patients. And then subsequently, there is a decline when patients would have less sexual partners, and there will also be the effect of cervical cancer screening, which can probably detect some of these infections already. So there will be a decline. So it's the prevalence would be an interplay of the age of sexual debut, the number of sexual partners, and whether there are screening that is happening for that particular patient. Aside from the host factors, so we talked about the viral factors, the host factors, there are also environmental and exogenous factors which can serve as modifiers of the natural history of HPV infection. And this we know, like long-term smoking, multiparity, long-term use of hormonal contraceptives should give you a 1.5 to 2-fold increase in risk of developing cervical cancer. This is recent, the increasing number of full-term pregnancies, 1.6-fold increase. The co-infection with Chlamydia trachomatis has been placed on hold because of inconsistent results with recent studies. And of course, HPV infection, HIV rather, is also another factor, not because of HIV itself, but due to the immunosuppression that HIV infection brings. So another method of prevention is actually having a healthy lifestyle, like stop smoking, don't prolong your use of oral contraceptives, and of course, mutual monogamy. Now, in 2006, the World Health Organization came up with this diagram for the basis of cervical cancer control. And at the bottom, but the biggest is primary prevention with vaccination, followed by secondary prevention with screening, and of course cancer treatment, and you already have disease, of course palliative care. Their newest table, the WHO, tells us that at different ages of women, you can engage in various types of prevention, like at girls 9 to 14 years old, it's primary prevention with HPV vaccination. Secondary prevention for women 30 years old and or older. And of course, for tertiary prevention, those already with the disease, they have to be treated. But aside from the HPV vaccination for the young girls, you have to also have health information, education, you can also have condoms, as well as male circumcision. How does HPV vaccination work? So what do we know about HPV vaccination as primary prevention? No? So there is good evidence that prophylactic HPV vaccines are immunogenic and effective against targeted type HPV infections and type-specific genital lesions. And there is good evidence that these vaccines are safe. There is evidence also to support some cross-protection against non-targeted types. And there are currently 3 vaccines protecting against both HPV 16 and 18, which account for at least 70% of cervical cancers. And WHO considers the 3 vaccines equally protective against cervical cancer. And it works best if administered prior to HPV exposure. And what WHO recommends is to vaccinate girls aged between 9 and 14 years old when they have not yet started sexual activity. Furthermore, 2 of the vaccines also protect against HPV 6 and 11, which cause anogenital warts. The vaccines are not therapeutic vaccines, or they are not for patients already with the premalignant lesions or cervical cancer. And some countries have included boys for HPV vaccination because of their role in the genital tract cancers like penile and anal, and to protect also against anogenital warts. No? And of course, HPV vaccination does not replace cervical cancer screening. So this table shows you the comparison of the 3 vaccines. So that you have the bivalent, which was introduced in 2006, that's the quadrivalent, and the nonavalent in 2014. Of course, bivalent has the 16 and 18, while quadrivalent has the addition of the low-risk type 6 and 11, while nonavalent, aside from increases in doses of 6, 16, and 18, also added 31, 33, 45, 52, and 58. It should be noted that in a study among Filipinos, HPV 45 was actually the 3rd most common based on a 2009 study. Of course, the adjuvant is different for the bivalent vaccine, the AS04, which gives it higher antibody titers compared to the aluminum salts in the quadri and nonavalent. But the efficacy among young females are very high, and immunogenicity studies among pre-adolescents show that they are equivalent. No? So for the nonavalent, it's a non-inferiority study to the quadrivalent vaccine. And immunogenicity and efficacy among older women, it's also equivalent. For bivalent, it's up to age 55. For the quadri, it's up to age 45. And again, the nonavalent is a non-inferiority study compared to the quadrivalent type. Again, high efficacies. Other efficacy studies of these vaccines included for the bivalent, the oral, vulvar, anal HPV infections in females. It's only the quadrivalent and the nonavalent which had males as part of their study. And for cross protection, it was shown that for bivalent, it was with 31, 33, and 45. For quadrivalent, to a limited extent, HPV 31. Of course, the nonavalent, it has the 7 types of high-risk HPV. And the duration of protection so far, at least 10 years for both bivalent and quadrivalent, and the titers remain high. And for the nonavalent, at least 5 years for now. And all have been shown to be safe, no? So, but what is the basis for the vaccine scheduling recommended by WHO? WHO recommends a 2-dose scheduling, and this was based on the immunogenicity trials, comparing the 2-dose versus the 3-dose. The 2-dose is the prime, and the boost, which will be given at 6 to 12 months, while the 3-dose schedule is at 0, 1 for the bivalent and 2 for the quadri and the non-available end at 6 months. And it was shown that there is equivalent immunogenicity. Okay? So that is what WHO recommends. The 2-dose schedule for girls ages 9 to 14 years old. What about HPV vaccination program? Vaccine. And the factors associated with successful implementation include timely intersectoral planning and collaboration, micro-planning for the new target population. These are the young girls, and delivery strategy. So will it be an through schools or through community health workers? If you do it through the community health workers, you will be able to identify the out-of-school population. You have to enumerate the eligible people and identify where to find them. Of course, substantial and sustained investment in communications and social mobilizations, including if there are negative news about HPV, then they should be corrected. But selecting sustainable and affordable delivery strategy is the key for a successful HPV vaccination program. Philippine efforts in HPV vaccination, well, what they had in 2016 was a phased-out introduction in selected areas instead of a nationwide rollout. And there, of course, there are also efforts of private groups in reaching out to children to have them vaccinated with HPV, the HPV vaccine. The 9 to 14 is significant, no? Because based on the young adult fertility and sexuality study, the latest one, YAC score, with more than 19,000 youths as respondents ages 15 to 24, it showed that the average age of sexual debut is 17 for males and 18.2 for females. And if we put the age of sexual debut as the index for having HPV exposure, then it will really be best to vaccinate them at ages 9 to 14 years old. And one more thing, 1 in 3 Pinoy youth has engaged in premarital sex, based also on the YAP study. And the trend in the past has shown also more of our youth engaging in premarital sex. So vaccination would really be very important. Of course, for secondary prevention, we go for screening. So WHO puts it for women 30 years old and older. So you can have the single visit approach. You do you can also have pap smears, and you can have HPV testing. What does WHO have to say regarding secondary prevention? So a woman should be screened at least once before ages 30 to 49. And HIV-infected women being immunocompromised should have a younger age of screening. Primary screening can be with HPV testing for the high-risk types, pap smear or cytology, or visual inspection with acetic acid. HPV detection is the test of first choice, provided the country's screening program can sustain it. And if that is used, the screening can be done every 5 years. One should ensure effective treatment of those who were tested positive for any of the ways of screening. And you try to reduce also the number of visits to health facilities. That's why the see and treat technique, like VIA followed by cryotherapy, have been promoted by several groups. Both cryotherapy and the loop electrosurgical excision procedures are appropriate treatments to screen positive women. And treated women should be followed up at least after 12 months. And even if you have the HPV vaccine, you still have to be screened. These are the American societies which gave us these recommendations. You already have HPV and cytology as co-testing every 5 years, which is the preferred one for ages 30 to 65 years old. And this is the patient with cervical cancer. You don't screen this patient anymore. You just have to do a biopsy if you have a gross lesion like that. And the number of years of latency of that HPV infection to become cervical cancer is the best time for you to catch pre-malignant lesions and give them treatment so they don't become cervical cancer in the future. Of course, you have the conventional pap smear, you have the liquid-based pap smear, and HPV testing using polymerase chain reaction. Visual inspection with acetic acid has been used in low resource settings with good pickup as well. And of course, the treatment part would include cryotherapy, which is destruction of abnormal cervical tissue using freezing, for as long as it's not cancer. And of course, getting large parts of the transformation zone using loop is our LEEP and the LLETZ or large loop electrosurgical excision of the transformation zone. And of course, tertiary prevention would mean treatment already of cervical cancer, either in of course, the 5 years is this benchmarking study which showed that if you have HPV negative and your Pap smear negative, your risk of developing a CIMT or a high-grade lesion in 5 years is only 0.08%. So you can do your HPV testing every 5 years. The last part of the lecture is about anogenital warts. No, that's why I said this is also a concern for men. No, what is the disease burden? It's the most common manifestation of HPV infection, especially of HPV 6 and 11. It accounts for 90%. And the median time between infection and the development of genital warts is longer in men, 11 to 12 months, 5 to 6 months in women. So the global estimates for anogenital warts are actually higher than cervical cancer. But with the introduction of the quadrivalent vaccine in some of the well-developed countries showed a reduction in the We're connected. Okay.
Okay. The first question for Dr. Toral is, aside from sex, what are the other modes of transmission of HPV infection?
Skin to skin contact of the genital area can also get it through that, aside from penetrative sex.
Okay. Jeanne, there are some concerns of like mothers, for example, or relatives that if they share like personal stuff like clothes or probably blankets, does it also pass on HPV coming from other HPV infected individuals?
There were previous reports of through infected beddings, but then maybe the virus will not be able to sustain the heat and the.
Doc.
Okay.
Doc, can you share your camera?
Share camera screen.
We repeat the question.
Share. Okay. Sorry.
Make sure your camera po is not muted.
Sorry. Camera off. Sorry. Can you see us?
Not yet po.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Yes po.
Okay, we're live.
So we'll repeat the question again. So the first question is, aside from sex, what are the other modes of transmission of HPV infection?
Genital skin-to-skin contact.
Okay. And just to emphasize or reassure the worries of relatives, for example, if it's passed on to personal items shared in the house, for example.
No. Yeah. Before, it used to be mentioned, infected beddings, but no, the virus will not be able to live with that.
Okay. For the second question, how often should colposcopy and biopsy be done after HPV exposure?
When HPV exposure, do you mean sexual initiation, or you were diagnosed already with you are positive for HPV, right? Is that what
from the
positive HPV based on an HPV testing result? As I mentioned earlier, 1 year would be the time to repeat the HPV test, and if you're positive, then you will label that as persistent HPV infection. You're assuming that the first test is not actually the time that you got the infection. It could have been a prevalent infection and would have been there longer. That's why the 12 months period gives you a safer window rather than 24 months.
Okay. For our next question would be, does use of condom, can it prevent HPV transmission?
It has been included as part of preventive strategy because of the protection of the genital skin.
Okay. Next, we have a number of very interested listeners here. So we have a number of questions, Dr. Toral. So next one would be, what treatment can be done with chronic cervicitis after being negative for HPV?
Actually, chronic cervicitis is a biopsy result which is considered negative. Negative because the cervix has residual macrophages on it. So any biopsy that is negative will be read as chronic cervicitis by the pathology. So it should not be treated.
In one of your slides, you discussed the different HPV vaccines. So the next question is, does it
so before their sexual debut. But the efficacy and immunogenicity studies show that for the bivalent, it's up to age 55, and for the quadrivalent and the non-valent, it's up to age 45. But you have to remember, for those who would like to be vaccinated in those older age group, that the titers that you probably will make will not be as high as the one in the 14 years old. And you might have already HPV exposure, or maybe even HPV infection, or even a pre-malignant lesion, which will not treat, the vaccine will not treat your pre-malignant lesion.
Okay. I think to the first question, is HPV vaccination recommended for boys, and at what age should this be?
The studies on males for HPV vaccination are only with the quadrivalent and the non-valent vaccine. And if you think that, Jeanne, the protection that the males will get would be for anogenital warts as well as penile and anal cancers. So there are some countries which actually include boys in their HPV vaccination programs.
Okay. This one again still related with the vaccination. Suppose a patient is promiscuous, she receives HPV vaccination. Will visual inspection with acetic acid play any role for screening or monitoring? If you receive HPV vaccination, is it still necessary for you to go through the secondary?
With cervical cancer. So I think from a public health point of view, it would be best to vaccinate the young.
Is it necessary, Jeanne, to actually screen patients first, do the smear first, and then that's the time you vaccinate, or there is really no need for a initial screening to get the vaccine?
Oh, okay.
Doc?
That's for the older women, I suppose, no?
Yeah.
Others would go ahead with HPV vaccination.
Doc, excuse po.
Yes, wala.
Please share your, yan.
Yeah, okay. So we're on again. Is it the only way to find out whether you already harbor the HPV after sexual debut would be through your HPV testing. So, but when you do it, it's very expensive. You know, as it is now, it's very expensive. But as my slide said, or as what WHO said, if the country can afford it in its program, then it is the first choice for screening.
Okay. This one. Is HPV infection transmitted through blood transfusion?
No, there's no evidence for that.
They probably confuse it with HIV. Okay. And I think this one, do you recommend HPV vaccination for men and women who will undergo transplantation? Transplantations who will receive immunosuppressive drugs?
Okay. These are also immunocompromised patients, and I suppose there are no studies on that particular group of women. So we don't know how much titers they will actually produce if they get vaccinated. So children. Probably they have to understand they not be the protection that they will get will not be the same as a normal healthy woman.
Okay, so we've been discussing a lot about the vaccination, so the age group, etc. So probably the last question on vaccination is there any contraindication for those who wants to receive it? Are there any specific diseases or condition of patients that will warrant them from excluding them from an HPV vaccine, for example?
So you're trying something like safety profile.
Yeah.
Adverse effect. There have been reports.
Thank you for joining us. We would also like to thank our sponsors again, MSD Philippines, for their support to this webinar. We hope to see you again in our upcoming webinar on March 13, 2019, Wednesday, 12 noon to 1 p.m. Manila time with our speaker, Dr. Merle Odi. And the title is Burden and Consequences of Residual Paralysis and the Value of Neuromuscular Monitoring, sponsored by MSD Philippines. Please invite your colleagues to join this continuing weekly CME webinar series. All webinar schedules and resources will be posted at the Facebook page